Welcome warmly, members, friends, elders, Temple Society staff, people who are young, middle-aged and seniors. We come together in this communally friendly way via Zoom on a winter morning. To begin, here is the proposition for this reflection as together we ease out of lockdown. What lessons will we learn from the virus? Political, social, religious, spiritual, ethical, or alternatively, very personal lessons no one else needing to know. Here is a chance to canvass how aspects of the pandemic have confronted us. The world over, hundreds of millions had sought connection throughout our enforced isolation. I hope our 30 minutes together continues that spirit of connection. We will hear and can sing along to a pre-recorded hymn by a European church choir. It's number 39 in the hymn book in German and English, and you've been sent a link to that via email for the words, and those words will come up on your screen. And we will see a slideshow later too. I decided the Bible reading assigned for today works as a coda or to wrap up. For me, lessons learned from the coronavirus across all those angles mentioned, political, social, religious, spiritual, ethical, and personal, boil down to experiencing hope and optimism. Both were a foil to my initial fear. Here is a quote. Pity our poor leaders confronted with the new reality. In the first weeks, they did what comes naturally. They gave us optimism. The Chinese began by pretending it wasn't there and shooting the messengers. The Brazilians said it was a fantasy. The Italians said, go to the piazza. The Iranians said, go to Com. The Australians said, go to the footy. President Trump said, go wherever you like. It's a hoax, a democratic hoax. It will vanish like a miracle. It's nothing to worry about. We have it under control. We cannot let the cure be worse than the problem itself, etc. Optimism has killed many thousands. Hope is essential for human beings, but optimism is voluntary. End quote. So penned Australian writer Don Watson in the monthly's May issue. By the way, just as Elder and TSA head Mark Howman will apply song lyrics and lunatic cartoons aptly to his themes, I tend to quote writers I admire. Reading is my essential motivator, and clear-thinking writers are a godsend, aren't they, for extending our own thoughts. Hope is a feature of a person's character. You can often pick up on this after a few minutes of conversation with the new person you meet, don't you think? Hope affects their view of the world, their behaviour, and ultimately their well-being. But trying to analyse or define hope is tricky. Is it an attitude, a virtue, an emotion? Or some combination of these? For simplicity, I will call hope an attribute. Optimism is also an attribute of a person's character, with interesting links to the rational and irrational. Optimists tend to overestimate the chances of positive things prevailing, while underestimating the likelihood of bad surprises. Bad surprises are what pessimists expect. Again, there is a correlation here with certain measures of well-being and mental health. Without a shred of hope or optimism, life is bleak. As you know, Australia's effective political and social policies prevented the worst potential of the pandemic from being unleashed in our country. A fearful public was by and large willing to abide by social distancing and isolation rules. These rules provided hope and trust in science and we could choose to be optimistic about our safety. But in other prosperous countries, this willingness to conform to rules was not the norm, and communities were consequently ravaged by the virus. A young writer and university student in Sydney, Grace Lagan, admitted to being pessimistic and angry at the outset of the pandemic. Yet another uncertainty and challenge for her generation. In fact, she was coping with radical uncertainty, as she called it, born of decreasing job prospects, climate anxiety, unaffordable rents, large student debts. But she confessed her change of heart in a column saying, quote, "As a young person, I've come to realize the power of hope in difficult times." I quote Grace Lagan further from The Guardian Australia on the 14th of May, 2020. "And herein lies the paradox of hope. The times when it is the hardest to find, we need it most. Hope cannot make the problems we face go away, nor can it solve them. But it gives us something even more enduring, the motivation to keep going in spite of it all. And as we begin to look beyond the immediate crisis, hope is the one commodity our generation must harness. I now know, for myself at least, that it won't be in short supply," end quote. This young writer was swayed by a supportive community during COVID-19, and when she herself pitched in for others during the crisis, her original pessimism reversed. Bad news and the righteous rage it can induce can provide the necessary cataclysm for action, she concluded. The cataclysm for action, still very current. My own hope and optimism reside in the solidity and reliability of organised communities. I wonder if in your adolescence and early adulthood you rejected being reliable. I often behaved unpredictably and acted on impulse, and my being unreliable put people out, although I tried to be polite and get away with apologising. My parents were reliable and predictable, qualities which I came to appreciate only later as I matured and tried to train myself to be so too. For me, this is the Temple Society, the reliability of my fellow elders, the steadfastness and dependability of our regional council, our head, our staff, volunteers, champion, the development of the community garden, our youth groups, the Sydney community striving year in, year out to retain its base, the archive, heritage, women's, men's groups, the TTHA with its remarkable new Sarona wing, Templar Talk, Templar Reflections, our German counterpart in TGD, and I've missed more, I'm sure, but all dependable and especially so in the past 3 months. A pat on the back and a shout out to our organisation. How willingly you work for the community in collaborative ways. And again recently, how hard you worked behind the scenes. Let's break for the hymn. This is an inspiring one, I think, based on Psalm 27, verse 14, about waiting for the Lord with patience and courage. It has just 2 verses. Let's sing hymn number 39, Harre meine Seele, Wait my soul with patience, along with a basic YouTube clip from an obscure group called Lechkirche Liedertafel, later to be demystified. elders. I mentioned them before the hymn. Our next presenter, Theo, will deliver a Founding Day service in a fortnight's time. I checked with Theo if he minded my noting our foundations through the Hope and Optimism that Christoph Hoffmann and Georg Hardegg embodied in their Odyssey of Palestinian Settlement. Theo kindly said, go for it. A selection of vintage postcard images will roll at the end of my remarks for atmosphere and context rather than their historical import. Through these, we revisit the very kind gift to TSA archives of Israeli friend Yoel Amir, transferring to us his philatelic postcard collection in 2017. Someone with no trace of radical uncertainty was Christoph Hoffmann in his resettlement mission. Driven by conviction in establishing a kingdom on earth, positive things could only flow for families and community as a progressive social experiment got off the ground. But imagine the realities. To help, a literary reference from Marianne Evans, known by her pen name George Eliot, in her 1861 novel Silas Marner. Imagine being, quote, suddenly transported to a new land where beings around them know nothing of their history and share none of their ideas, in which the past becomes dreamy because its symbols have all vanished, and the present too is dreamy because it is linked with no memories. End of quote. How strikingly relevant to the zeitgeist of great population movements out of Europe in the 1800s. Ironically, George Eliot was merely describing a move from one English village to another. And just one of the upshots for our Templar forebears as they snapped out of a dreamy fog was their rapid adaptation to challenging new environments by absorbing Arabic and Hebrew languages. Multilingual Templars are described by Doris Frank in her heritage pages of the latest Templar Reflections, Words, Words, Words of April 2020, which I recommend to you. Doris writes, quote, at the time of their arrival in Palestine, a province of the Ottoman Empire, some knowledge of Turkish and Arabic was of value in the 1800s. After World War I, Palestine was governed by the British and English became a useful language to know. Close quote. Property and real estate documents were written in Arabic, and Templars would have had to negotiate these locally and negotiate commerce too in smatterings of Hebrew and Yiddish. So our forebears were adventurous, sometimes multilingual and forward-thinking, with some nonetheless bringing their conservative values of close village traditions into the mix. It is curious to think that we, several generations on, may carry echoes of these attributes in our own dispositions, including the hope and optimism that saw them through. Perhaps Hoffmann recognized that by simply rolling over and accepting things as they were, decline would continue to erode faith and community. It was a monumental risk, leading a journey into the unknown, but thirst for new stability, for spiritual nourishment and community renewal made the risk a tantalizing thing. He interrogated Lutheran society and its values, questioned attitudes to mainstream religious education, and created a theological movement upon which our collective generations have built. A democratic socialist in his orientation, he was increasingly critical of authority, high society, and the official church. With us resides the legacy of open thinking and caring deeply about the community, the Templar community, as well as our disadvantaged fellow human beings. For a summary of other spiritual inheritances, Elder Irene Busso and I put our heads together on a proposal for a conference a couple of years ago, which in the end was not presented, but it distilled our thinking into this. Our faith community has adapted to changes over 160 years, from institutionalized religion to a customized, personalized, do-it-yourself spirituality. These adaptations arose from relocations across 3 continents, from the intersection of science and theology in 19th century Germany to seeking freedom of belief in the Ottoman Holy Land, and eventually to the challenges of maintaining a progressive Christian community in contemporary Australia. Ours is an historical approach to the teachings of Jesus, where we take the Bible story seriously, but not literally. Our spirituality includes thinking about the kingdom of God as a central concept in the faith of the Temple Society. Our elders deliver services without any religious hierarchy, with a focus on conscience and reason influencing our religious understandings. Freedom of personal belief is an important principle for our faith community. A break now for the postcard pictures I mentioned, going back in time between 75 and 120 years. Well, finally to our reading. Bearing in mind, we take the Bible stories seriously, but not necessarily literally. Here is the Gospel of Mark, chapter 5, verses 21 to 34. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders, named Jairus, came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, "If I can just touch his clothes, I will be healed." Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." So, the healing of the bleeding woman, a metaphor or factual, is a story with hope at its heart. It seems hope as a human force has really not changed in more than 2,000 years. Rolling up to the 1860s, the founding years of the Temple Society, and right up to now, 2020. I do hope we shared an encouraging and fertile reflection. An observation again about hope and optimism is that they can echo through generations. Importantly too, hope and optimism are attributes we can choose to embed, and our well-being is enhanced when hope and optimism motivate us to become our better selves. A COVID-19 legacy? Let us hope so. Now to end with a prayer. God, you are the higher power who has given us the love of our family members, love of our friends, and of our community. Keep alive in our hearts the empathy and tenderness we felt during the strange weeks and months of restrictions under COVID-19. Make us forget slights or offences, but remember with gratitude the times of strong connections and a natural trust in human goodness. Bring us serenity of mind and a continuation of the good work undertaken by our community, to which we are so grateful to belong. Amen. A final note now on Lechkirche Liedertafel, that place that's so hard to say, regarding the YouTube clip. So we saw that behind the one hymn. If not for social distancing and Zoom, who could have predicted we'd be singing along with the unknown, to me at least, Lechkirche Liedertafel in Transylvania? It was founded in the 12th century by colonists trekking from Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Rhine-Moselle region. It has a rich and eventful history as Romanians have lived together for centuries with Transylvanian Saxons, Hungarians, Jews, and Roma, all shaping this cultural landscape. Religious tolerance, multilingualism, and peaceful coexistence were and are part of everyday life in Transylvania. Transylvanian Saxons, together with other ethnic German subgroups in newly enlarged Romania, namely Banat Swabians, Satmar Swabians, Bessarabian Germans, Dobrujian Germans, and Zipser Germans, became part of that country's broader German minority. Today, relatively few still live in Romania. Of 36,000 Germans, 11,700 were of Transylvanian Saxon descent. Most left in a mass exodus of Romanian Germans in the 1980s and 1990s, when communism collapsed in Eastern Europe. But their identity leads to an ongoing dialogue about past and future, home, exile, and cultural preservation. Rather familiar echoes. Thank you very much for your company. I'm still a relative newbie and owe much to my fellow elders who remain a support and inspiration. I look forward to Theo riffing on our founding story next time, and Renate Beilharz reminds us through her email sign-off to live fully, love generously, be all you can be, inspired by J.S. Spong. Now, a reminder, the group chat will be live straight after this. It's just a social chat if you feel like it, and you click on that link. Greetings all, and goodbye for now.